Good evening and welcome to NTD News. I'm Stephania Cox. Here are today's top stories. President Trump cancels a GOP convention in Florida. He's also proposing a new strategy aimed at reopening schools. New details on the upcoming stimulus package. The Treasury Secretary says they're looking to replace the $600 weekly unemployment benefits with a 70% wage replacement. Riots broke out in Portland. Some individuals started fires at the city's federal courthouse, while the city's police have been barred from working with federal officers. The FBI have charged and are investigating a Chinese researcher in California. She is reportedly hiding out at a Chinese consulate. The investigation revealed that she secretly works for the Chinese military. More American workers are filing jobless claims. The number rose last week after falling for several months. And a historian shares why he thinks it's strange for the Black Lives Matter organization to have Marxist roots. President Trump says he's canceling a GOP convention in Florida due to virus hotspots. He also proposed a new plan that would give parents money to send their children to a school of their choice.
People elected me to help and to protect. So I told my team it's time to cancel the Jacksonville, Florida component of the GOP convention. Will be starting in North Carolina for the Monday, as has always been planned. We were never taking that off. That's remaining as it is. The delegates are going to get together.
President Trump says he dropped the convention in Florida because of its virus hotspots. He says he will have tele-rallies and that he will make a convention speech, but not at a big crowded event. The president also said that he's asking Congress for $105 billion in funding for schools in the upcoming stimulus package. And if the district schools don't reopen, he says that money should be given to parents so they can send their children to a school of their choice. An update on the next stimulus package. The Treasury Secretary says they're considering a 70% wage replacement instead of the $600 enhanced unemployment benefit. NTD's Miguel Moreno has more on what that deal could look like.
Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin went over a few potential pieces of the next stimulus package expected to be revealed soon. Mnuchin mentioned that they don't plan to extend the $600 of enhanced unemployment benefits. Instead, they're looking to give 70% of an unemployed American's lost weekly wages.
The unemployment insurance, we're going back up to see the new language and work through that, but I think we're very clear on we're not going to pay people more to stay home than to work. So we're looking at something that looks like a 70% wage replacement, and we're working on the mechanics of that.
The current $600 enhancement benefit goes on top of the recipient's unemployment check. That benefit is set to expire this month. There is speculation that the unemployed may receive $200 to $300 less a week in extra benefits. Last week ended with over 1.4 million initial unemployment claims. Contrary to the Republicans' expected $1 trillion stimulus package, Democrats are unified behind their $3 trillion HEROES Act. The Democrats' plan would extend the $600 extra unemployment benefit till next year. Mnuchin also mentioned that the administration is apparently considering $105 billion for schools and $25 billion for COVID-19 testing. Miguel Moreno, NTD News.
Mnuchin says proposals on direct payments in the deal would mirror the last stimulus package. That means another round of $1,200 stimulus checks may be included. And rioters in Portland started fires at the base of the city's federal courthouse last night. Federal agents used tear gas to disperse the crowds after some tried to break into the building. Also, late on Wednesday, the Portland City Council barred police from working with federal law enforcement.
This is the 5th warning that tear gas may be used.
Portland police ordered crowds of protesters to leave the area or else be arrested or tear gassed. Department of Homeland Security agents helped local law enforcement protect federal property against vandalism. Police declared the anti-racism demonstration a riot after agitators threw firebombs over the fence surrounding the federal courthouse. Thousands of people gathered downtown where the air was filled with tear gas. One dissenter carried a red Antifa flag and wore a helmet, dressed in all black and carrying a backpack. Other rioters, also dressed in black, attempted to tear down a fence surrounding the courthouse. Rioters were heard shouting, "This is not a riot, this is a revolution." The scene became more intense when some sort of explosive detonated near the courthouse. What appears to be local law enforcement were spotted marching in formation, and helicopters monitored the scene from overhead. Portland's mayor, Ted Wheeler, was speaking at the demonstration and listening to protesters. At one point, he was stung by tear gas and told the New York Times that he saw nothing that provoked this response from police. President Trump has sent federal agents to Portland to quell the violence. U.S. law states the Secretary of Homeland Security shall protect federal property, such as the Portland courthouse. Some argue Trump is fulfilling his duty to ensure that the law is faithfully executed by sending in federal agents to protect the courthouse. Reporting by Kevin Hogan, NTD News, and Bowen Xiao, The Epic Times.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo speaking about U.S.-China relations today at the Nixon Presidential Library. This is the latest in a string of speeches focusing on what he calls the Chinese Communist Party's unlawful tactics. The title of his speech, Communist China and the Free World's Future.
The free world is still winning. We just need to believe it and know it and be proud of it. People from all over the world still want to come to open society.
Pompeo's message to Americans and all free nations. He says it's time for a new alliance of law-abiding countries to come together and stand up to the Chinese Communist Party.
If our companies invest in China, they may wittingly or unwittingly support the Communist Party's gross human rights violations.
Likening the CCP to the Soviet Union, the difference, he says, is that the CCP is closely entangled with the global community, but goes on to say that America shouldn't worry, and neither should the world. He has faith we can tackle it.
But Beijing is more dependent on us than we are on them.
Explaining that the only way to truly change China is not to watch what they say, but how they behave. One thing Pompeo says he's observed over his years serving in the army during the Cold War was that communists always lie, but that the biggest lie they tell is speaking for their citizens who are terrified to speak out. Using the example of Dr. Li Wenliang, who tried to tell the world about the CCP virus before he was censored by the regime and later died from the virus. Pompeo calls on the world's free nations to stand up to the Chinese Communist Party and protect the free world in the wake of repeated threats to the world's security and freedom.
Trouble is brewing at a Chinese consulate in San Francisco, where a person with connections to the country's military is reportedly hiding out. It follows the ordered closure of a Chinese consulate in Houston a day earlier. President Trump says it's always possible that more Chinese missions will be ordered to shut down.
According to an FBI assessment, the San Francisco consulate is harboring a charged individual who was found to have secret connections to the Chinese military. The individual was working as a researcher at the University of California, Davis. She's a suspect in an intellectual property theft-related case and was charged on June 26 with visa fraud. Tang Juan came to the U.S. on a J-1 visa. On her application, Tang stated that she didn't have any affiliation with the Chinese military. But an investigation proved otherwise. The FBI searched her home and found evidence that she worked at China's Air Force Military Medical University. She has since been hiding out at the Chinese consulate in San Francisco. The Department of Justice says China is aware of the situation. This is one of many such cases involving Chinese military scientists coming to the U.S. under false pretenses. President Trump indicated that more Chinese missions may close if necessary.
It's always possible. You see what's going on. We thought there was a fire in the one that we did close, and everybody said there's a fire, and I guess they were burning documents or burning papers, and I wonder what that's all about.
The Trump administration ordered the Chinese consulate in Houston to shut down on Tuesday. Overnight in Houston, firefighters went to the consulate after smoke was seen. Houston police told Fox 26 that staff there were burning documents. These were likely to be sensitive files. The State Department said the closure was to protect American intellectual property and Americans' private information. Beijing said it would retaliate.
U.S. officials spoke of subversive behavior and stealing trade secrets as reasons for closing the Chinese consulate in Houston, calling the consulate an epicenter of research theft.
Addressing the closure of China's consulate in Houston, Texas, a State Department spokesperson accused China of massive illegal spying and influence operations. A State Department official told the New York Times that the Houston consulate had a history of engaging in subversive behavior and was the epicenter of research theft in the United States. He also said that China ramped up the attempted theft over the last 6 months, and their target could be the virus vaccine research. Texas is a bioscience center in the U.S. and is home to some of the best and largest medical institutions in the country. Several local companies and institutions are currently developing vaccines for the virus. Prominent medical centers in the state have been targets of infiltration by the CCP. In May, the University of Texas system was required by the administration to provide records of gifts or contracts from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The two have cooperated in some programs since 2018. The university is also required to disclose potential ties to the Chinese Communist Party and 24 Chinese universities and companies, including Huawei and the state-owned China National Petroleum. Last year, Houston's prominent Arson Cancer Center fired 3 scientists for allegedly helping China steal federally funded research. The 3 were said to be part of China's 1,000 Talents program, where U.S. professors and researchers were paid well to work for Chinese universities or research centers during holidays while keeping their job at the U.S. labs. Last month, multiple U.S. media referencing FBI sources reported that China's ambassador Cui Tiankai and a Chinese diplomat in New York City are personally involved in recruiting scientists for the program. Hong Kong media reported that China might close the U.S. consulate in Chengdu to retaliate. President Trump said it's always possible the U.S. will close more Chinese diplomatic outposts. Penny Zhou, NTD News.
A 93-year-old former Nazi concentration camp guard has been found guilty of being an accessory to the murder of more than 5,000 people. The guard, identified as Bruno D., was charged over his time as an SS guard at the Sutthof concentration camp from 1944 to 1945. He was given a 2-year suspended prison sentence. More than 40 co-plaintiffs from France, Israel, Poland, and the United States testified against him. Concluding just over 75 years after World War II ended in Europe, it will almost certainly be one of the last trials of a former Nazi. And coming up, we hear from a historian who points out why it's strange that calls to end racism in America are backed by an organization tied to Marxism. And New York City's iconic St. Patrick's Cathedral is struggling. It depends on donations from tourists and business people, but for now, there aren't many around. And wellness experts share dietary and lifestyle advice to help alleviate anxiety about the virus. Find out what they have to say and more after the break.
We are being censored. America's news outlets no longer provide the truth. 90% of news outlets in the United States are controlled by 6 corporations. They're not out to tell you the truth of what's happening. They're out to tell you the picture of the world that they represent. The mission of the Epoch Times is to chase the truth, to ground all statements in facts, and prevent people from being misled. The Epoch Times is independent. We're not controlled by any special interests, and we never will be. The Epoch Times is a non-partisan media. That means we don't stand for any political party. This is a battle between truth and deceit, a battle between forces that would ensnare this country in ignorance, and between a media that wants to present you with the truth. Subscribe today and join the Americans who are seeking truth and tradition. We'd love to have you on board.
The nation continues to see protests and calls to end systemic racism in America. One historian points out why it's strange for an organization like Black Lives Matter to have Marxist roots. NTD's Melina Weiskup brings us more.
It's no secret that the Black Lives Matter organization is propped up by the communist ideology. The organization's official pamphlet reads, Communist Party USA. Founder Patrisse Cullors has said in multiple interviews that the leaders of Black Lives Matter are, quote, trained Marxists. But historian Phil Magnus says it's disturbing and strange to see Marxism championing racial equality, since Karl Marx himself, the father of communism, held strikingly racist views.
He has letters that are filled with dozens of examples of he uses the N-word disparagingly, talks about blacks as if they are inferior.
Magnus pointed out a specific example. In a letter to his good friend Frederick Engels, Marx talks in a degrading manner about a man named Ferdinand Lassalle. The sheer gluttony and wanton lechery of this idealist. As the shape of his head and the way his hair grows also testify that he has descended from the Negroes, unless his mother or paternal grandmother interbred with the N-word. And that's just one of multiple examples.
So to see him as kind of repurposed and maybe glossed over and turned into this hero of a movement that genuinely cares about racial equality is disturbing.
And yet the very group that says it's working towards a more racially just America has Marx's communist sickle and hammer behind them, perhaps without awareness of what that symbol indicates, since most of the ideas attached to it seem appealing. But those ideas have never been practiced successfully. History has proven time and time again that successfully practicing communism never eventuated. A notable historical lesson being the Russian Revolution of 1917, which was an uprising by the people to overthrow a disliked Tsar.
But what happened over the course of that revolution is the Leninists, who were the hardcore Marxian faction, the claimed successors to Karl Marx in Lenin's own terms, gradually moved into power, and they started shutting out other groups, including not only conservatives and opposition groups, but other competing socialist factions.
Yet some are still lured in by communism's deceptive ideology.
People here understand communism and what that actually means, and it is not totalitarian, it is not authoritarian.
Perhaps some are not as familiar with the dark side of Marx. Once a devout Christian, Marx then turned against the Creator. In his poem The Fiddler, Marx wrote, "Till hearts bewitch, till senses reel, with Satan I have struck my deal. He chalks the signs, beats time for me, I play the death march fast and free." And even today, the world still sees that horrific bloodbath play out in communist-influenced regimes. In Venezuela, famine is rampant. In China, citizens are brutally persecuted for their faith, and freedom of belief and freedom of expression are forcibly suppressed. Melina Weiskup, NTD News.
St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City is in a tough situation. Most of the church's income is from people visiting the church and making donations. But without tourists and office workers in the area, they're having a hard time covering costs. Our reporter Kevin Hogan spoke with the church's rector to learn more about how they're making it through the tough times.
The solemn hymns of the prominent St. Patrick's Cathedral can now be experienced in the flesh. During the lockdowns, the church had been closed for 15 weeks and worshipers could only attend Mass online. Churchgoers must wear masks and follow social distancing guidelines with only 1 or 2 people every third pew. One believer said she stayed home for 6 weeks during the lockdown and she considers it to be a cleansing experience, like a retreat.
You know how Catholics do a lot of retreat where we have to stay home and kind of meditate and kind of look inside your life and your faith, and this is what makes your faith stronger, because then you realize during this difficult time you still have God with you. God watching over you.
Usually over 5 million people visit this heavenly sanctuary every year. And on a given Sunday, over 1,000 faithful assemble to listen to the gospel. But for this weekday noon Mass, only about 50 people attended. The city is now in phase 4 of its reopening plan, but that hasn't increased the number of people allowed in. The cathedral's rector, Monsignor Ritchie, says they're still limited to 25% capacity. But he says that's enough because not many people are attending since they're nervous about being in a large crowd. This has made it difficult for the church to pay its expenses, and the rector had to ask for help.
I beg all the time. I'm begging people to help support us, because I have to worry about the people who work here. I have to worry about the security of the place. I have to worry about the safety of the place, and all of that needs money to keep going.
Monsignor Ritchie says in a given day there will be 10 to 25,000 people watching the services online. At his request, many people have made small donations, which has given the church the support it needs. The finances weren't the only challenge that St. Patrick's faced during the lockdowns. The church and its community struggled spiritually as well. It was difficult not being able to do the sacraments like baptism, communion, and marriage that are important to do in person. But fortunately, now they're able to do these services, just at a smaller scale. Reporting from New York, Kevin Hogan, NTD News.
Coming up, on Thursday alone, 5 earthquakes hit Tibet, with the highest having a magnitude of 6.6. And experts describe the current U.S.-China financial strife as more challenging than the Cold War economic rivalry against the Soviet Union. That and more after the break.
Viewers have described China Uncensored like The Daily Show, but about China.
In China, something can be illegal, but still in common practice. For example, bribery, or intellectual property theft, or Uber.
At the beginning, I was super excited when I got 500 views, and now the show's grown to about 500,000 subscribers on YouTube. One episode reached 7.9 million people and counting. I'm a little freaked out that many people have seen my face.
Hey, have you heard of China Uncensored? It's starring me.
It's more and more obvious that China is having a major influence on the U.S.
Hey, have you heard of China Uncensored? 中国揭秘.
In 5 years, I see China Uncensored as the only show on TV or the internet. It will be the sole source of edutainment worldwide.
Have you heard of China Uncensored?
Yeah, I have.
You actually have? He's heard of China Uncensored.
I love China Uncensored.
The Chinese regime has been coming under increased scrutiny by world powers. And now a famous law professor inside China vows to continue fighting for the country's freedom. NTD's Tiffany Meyer brings us more.
Xu Zhangren, a famous law professor from one of China's most prestigious universities, has declared that he will continue to fight for China's freedom. His comments come after he was released from detention. Professor Xu is known for being an open critic of the Chinese Communist Party and its leader Xi Jinping. After he was set free, Xu published an open letter saying totalitarianism is doomed to failure and freedom will eventually come to China. He also vowed to continue fighting for freedom as long as he lives. Xi has published multiple essays criticizing the tyranny of the CCP, as well as Xi's concentration of power and crackdown on dissidents. In May, she asked Chinese leaders to reflect on their handling of the pandemic and apologize for their mistakes. People from the university where she previously worked together raised over $14,000 to help him after he was fired. She says he plans to donate it to those in need. 2 weeks ago, she was suddenly taken away by police from his home in Beijing and charged with consorting with prostitutes. Xi's friend revealed that the police arrested him because of his open criticism of the party. The university fired Xu for so-called moral corruption immediately after he was released from detention last week. 3 senior infectious disease specialists and clinical professors resigned from the microbiology department of the University of Hong Kong at this critical moment to fight the CCP virus. The 3 experts all studied under Yuan Guoyong, the first scholar in the world to confirm that SARS is caused by coronavirus in 2003. One of those who resigned, clinical professor Susanna Lau, received a nearly $400,000 government grant to combat the CCP virus before she resigned. She is currently studying the infection dynamics of the CCP virus in bats and human cells, trying to explore potential therapeutics. A university spokesman confirmed the microbiology department staff changes will take place in the coming academic year and says they resigned for personal reasons. There is a total of 8 clinical professors on the team. Yan Limeng, the whistleblower that disclosed the CCP virus cover-up of the virus on Fox News recently, is also from the University of Hong Kong. Now we look at one form of natural disaster that seems to be plaguing China: earthquakes. For weeks, earthquakes have been striking various regions in China. On Thursday alone, 5 earthquakes hit Tibet, with the highest having a magnitude of 6.6. This is the country's 3rd earthquake at or above a magnitude 6 this year. Another 4 quakes of around magnitude 4 were also recorded. China state-run media reported 0 casualties, though we couldn't independently verify it. The depth of all 5 of Thursday's quakes were about 6 miles or less, considered shallow and without reaching far down into the Earth's surface. Earthquakes that occur at a depth of less than 43 miles are classified as shallow focus earthquakes and can be extremely devastating in densely populated areas. Now we turn to the world economy. Experts describe the current U.S.-China financial strife as more challenging than the Cold War economic rivalry against the Soviet Union. One reason is the size of China's economy. The Soviet Union's economy at the time was about 40% the size of the U.S. economy. Meanwhile, China's economy today is 2/3 the size of the U.S. economy. Secondly, unlike the Soviet Union, the American economy is deeply connected to that of China. One expert says the United States' relationship with Communist China can't simply carry on as business as usual. And now an update on the China-Australian relations. Chinese warships have recently confronted the Australian Navy in the South China Sea. The Australian vessels were sailing nearby the Spratly Islands, which are claimed by Beijing as well as the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam. But the Australian ships reportedly didn't go within 12 nautical miles of the disputed shores. Australia, Japan, and the U.S. were conducting a joint military drill in the Pacific Ocean when the Chinese warships confronted one of Australia's ships.
After Beijing imposed the draconian national security law in Hong Kong, many businesses rushed to self-censor, removing post-it notes with messages that could be used against them. But some persisted with the protest by using a creative approach. NTD's Juliet Song reports.
In Hong Kong, these colorful blank notes are becoming a new form of resistance.
We are trying to tell Hong Kongers that this is the only thing that we yellow shops can do. If we don't persist, we will no longer be able to deliver our message to others.
Yellow shops are businesses that openly support Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. In contrast, blue shops are those that support the city's police. During the protest, yellow shops have provided space for people to hang notes expressing their support for the movement. But things took a dip after Beijing imposed a sweeping law this June. The law punishes secession and subversion, and those convicted may face life in prison. Fearing the messages could be used to prosecute them, some yellow shops rushed to remove the notes when the law took effect. While some self-censored, only tearing down notes with messages they considered the most sensitive. Still, others took a creative approach. After removing all the written notes, they put up new ones, but this time they're all blank. A customer said it's just a different way of expressing their pro-democracy demands.
If you don't allow us to protest that way, we'll find another way to protest.
A professor says the shops are trying to express their opinions without getting into legal trouble.
they put on blank nukes, so that actually even if the government wants to prosecute against them, there is nothing that can be used against them.
Besides businesses, activists are also making their message clear that they refuse to back down. Prominent activist Nathan Law met with State Secretary Pompeo in London this week. Law tweeted that the two discussed the latest threats from Beijing national security law, possible Beijing interference in Hong Kong's upcoming Legislative Council elections, and Beijing's human rights abuses. He fled Hong Kong after the security law went into effect, while another prominent activist, Joshua Wong, chose to stay. Not only that, Wong also applied to run for a seat in Hong Kong's legislature.
Our voice is our vote, and we hope to let the world to know how we not choose to surrender, how we choose not to kowtow to China.
In a BBC interview, Wong said he believes he's now being followed by what appears to be Chinese agents. Juliet Song, NTD News.
Coming up, more American workers are filing jobless claims. The number rose last week after falling for several months in a row. And the latest retailer to file for bankruptcy is Ann Taylor owner Arson. The company will survive a permanent shutdown, but at a cost. Find out more after the break.
大提琴不仅仅是一件乐器，它是有生命、有感情的，需要我们精心的照顾。往往我们一个小小的动作，可能都会对人情绪产生微妙的影响。天音的品牌是福星，我们对于传统的理念很荣幸被神韵艺术团选为指定供应商。时间是酿造音色的不可替代的陪伴。我跟大提琴已经有60多年的友情了，每一把琴都有它自己的个性，熟悉它，才能真正发挥它的潜力。所以，我希望给你的每一把琴，都是首先我所信任的。
Morgan Stanley is blocking its Chinese interns from accessing its virtual network. Foreign companies have been increasingly concerned over China's tough cybersecurity rules. Experts say because of the complex cyber rules in China, firms don't want to risk having interns break the rules in an unsupervised environment, such as when they work from home. The interns were supposed to do virtual programs, but the bank says it will provide in-person training for its Chinese interns instead. Another large U.S. bank says its systems in China were exposed to frequent cyber attacks. The cyber attacks in China were infinitely greater than in many other countries. And after falling for 4 straight months, the number of American workers filing jobless claims rose last week. It suggests the labor market recovery is stalling.
The number of Americans filing for unemployment benefits rose last week for the first time in nearly 4 months. Labor Department figures show that over 1.4 million American workers applied for unemployment benefits last week. This is the first increase since March, when it peaked at nearly 7 million. The rise in unemployment claims suggests the labor market recovery is stalling during a surge of COVID-19 cases and depressed demand. Authorities in the hard-hit South and West regions have moved to shut down businesses again or put reopenings on pause, and small business hiring has slowed in these areas. The data shows the biggest increases in jobless claims for the week before last were in Florida, Georgia, and California. In the first week of July, there were nearly 32 million American workers receiving unemployment benefits across all programs. In the comparable week in 2019, that number was 1.7 million.
A new study estimates the Paycheck Protection Program helped save about 2.3 million jobs through the first week of June. The study said the program boosted employment by at least 2%, up to over 4%. The study was based on data from a payroll processor through the first week of June. It didn't analyze PPP data directly. The research suggests giving money directly to companies helped curb job losses during the pandemic. The program was intended to serve as a lifeline for the nation's smallest employers. The stimulus program has distributed over $500 billion in loans to small businesses. So $500 billion loans save 2.3 million jobs, about $217,000 per job. Interesting numbers. And billionaires beware. Sponsors of a new wealth tax proposal in New York say it could raise over $5 billion a year. New York, of course, facing a $13 billion deficit right now. So progressive lawmakers want to take from the rich, but rather than cut government services.
Progressive lawmakers in New York are proposing a new tax on New York billionaires. It would impose a new form of capital gains tax on New York residents with $1 billion or more in assets. Sponsors say it would raise $5.5 billion a year. It would be used for a new unemployment insurance fund dedicated to workers affected by the pandemic. Right now, taxpayers only pay capital gains tax on assets when they sell. But the new policy would tax any gain in value of an asset during the year, whether it's sold or not. That means if assets lose value, the billionaires can also use the loss to reduce future taxes. New York's governor says the new plan will only cause billionaires to relocate to other states with lower taxes. He says a federal tax hike across the country is a better idea, and to not single out New York. Tax advisors and accountants say billionaires could easily game the system to avoid the tax, such as valuing their assets lower than the true market value.
The parent company of Ann Taylor and Lane Bryant has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Epicenter Retail Group operates nearly 3,000 stores, mostly at malls. It's been struggling with debt and weak sales for years. The company has reached an agreement with creditors to reduce debt by $1 billion. More than half of its stores will be shut down. It got $150 million of new funds to keep operating during its reorganization. The company is the latest of 40-some retailers to file for bankruptcy this year. And AMC Theaters is delaying its opening in the U.S. once again. It's postponing reopening until mid to late August. It was set for a phased reopening starting on July 15th, with the goal of being fully operational by July 24th. That timetable was then pushed back by about 2 weeks. AMC and other movie theaters were anticipating the release of Christopher Nolan's action thriller, Tenet, but Warner Brothers said this week that it was indefinitely postponed. The company has 450 theaters in the U.S. It has reopened about a third of its theaters in the Middle East and Europe. And up next, the EU is the world's largest market, but it doesn't have a common migration policy. EU leaders are calling for a change. And Ukraine sees a second hostage crisis. This time, a police chief is the hostage. More on these after the break. Over to Europe. After reaching a recovery deal, now EU leaders have another goal. That's to find a common migration police. No one wants another migration crisis. NTD UK's Neil Woodrow will bring us news from Europe.
Thanks. Welcome to the NTD UK newsroom, bringing you UK and European news. After a two-day migration conference in Vienna, EU leaders call for a new set of policies.
Now that EU member states have agreed on a recovery deal, they're turning their attention to immigration.
This is the moment now. Europe cannot fail twice on migration.
EU Commissioner Margaritis Skinas said a key pillar of the future immigration policy would be sending people back to their home countries if they had no right to asylum. This comes as some EU countries revealed a recent rise in migrants' arrivals.
At the moment, we are experiencing 300 to 400 arrivals daily, the same number as before the onset of the pandemic.
Austrian Interior Minister Karl Nehammer also announced the opening of a new coordination centre in Vienna. The centre will focus on cooperation in areas such as border protection, asylum applications, deportations and fighting human smuggling.
And a second hostage situation in 3 days in Ukraine is over. An armed man who took a senior police officer captive escaped into the forest, abandoning the car and his hostage. In the central city of Poltava, police were attempting to arrest a man suspected of hijacking a vehicle when he took out a grenade and threatened to kill an officer. After negotiations, he agreed to swap the officer for a police colonel and drove off with him in a car provided by police. On Facebook, Ukraine's Deputy Interior Minister said the hostage taker has been previously convicted for drug offences and theft. In another hostage situation this week, an armed man, later described as unstable, held bus passengers captive for over 12 hours before releasing them unharmed. Moving on, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson on a visit to Scotland, where he dismissed any push for Scottish independence.
Prime Minister Johnson was in the north of Scotland 1 year since winning the Conservative leadership race and taking office. He praised the strength of the United Kingdom.
What I'm saying is that the Union is a fantastically strong institution. It's helped our country through thick and thin.
Johnson also emphasised that the union of the United Kingdom's 4 nations, England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, is vital for economic recovery and dismissed the push for another Scottish independence referendum. In 2014, Scots voted against independence 55% to 45%.
I think what people really want to do is see our whole country coming back strongly together, and that's what we're going to do.
Johnson published an article in The Times, Scotland, highlighting that during the pandemic, the British government supported 900,000 Scottish workers and provided $5.8 billion for Scottish healthcare and other public services. Scotland's ruling Scottish National Party is pushing for a second referendum. Recent polls show that support for independence has a slim majority.
And French President Emmanuel Macron is demanding EU sanctions against Turkey over drilling in Greek and Cyprus waters.
President Macron's comments came after Turkey announced new drilling surveys in waters between Cyprus and the Greek island of Crete.
It would be a serious mistake to leave our security in the Mediterranean in the hands of other actors.
The European Union has already sanctioned Turkey over drilling for natural gas in the eastern Mediterranean, but Macron says it is not enough.
It is not acceptable for the maritime space of a member state of our union to be violated or threatened. Those who are responsible must be sanctioned.
Massive natural gas reserves were discovered in recent years in waters off Cyprus. Turkey and Greece have fought to claim the reserves.
The editor-in-chief of Hungary's leading independent news website, Index.hu, has been fired just weeks after warning the media outlet's independence was at risk. Concerns over independence arose when a pro-government businessman, Miklos Vassili, acquired significant control over the website's funding. Ownership said Sajboch Dol fired after he couldn't control internal tensions after Vassili's arrival. Dol said he was sacked for warning that Index's independence was at risk. In June, Index changed its barometer on editorial freedoms in the company from independent to in danger. And Siemens is starting to roll out its Comfy mobile phone app for staff returning to the workplace. The app gives data on occupancy levels and updates on the local CCP virus situation, so workers can comply with social distancing rules. It can also block desks if there's a suspected infection through its contact tracing feature. The app will initially be available at half of Siemens' 1,300 factories and offices. Eventually, 100,000 staff will have access across 30 countries. Siemens already sells the app to external customers. That's all for today. Back to New York.
Thanks, Neil. And police in Chile are training 3 golden retrievers and 1 Labrador to detect those with the virus. A dog's nose is about 50 times more sensitive than a human's. These dogs have already been working for years in detecting explosives. They only need to learn a new smell. Germany, Finland, France, and England all have dogs that can detect people with the virus, even when asymptomatic. The virus itself does not have a smell, but the infection generates a certain type of sweat that the dogs can detect. Chilean police hope to have these 4 dogs ready to start patrols in mid-September. And coming up, Major League Baseball begins its season with a game between the Yankees and Nationals. But new safety measures are changing up the experience for players and fans. And floating open-air cinemas start in Paris as the city's annual beach event opens to residents and tourists. This year, it's a little different, but the mood is still festive. Stay with us for that after the break.
5,000 years of Chinese music and dance in one night.
Just so inspiring. It makes me want to go dance.
It's breathtaking, brilliant.
It's out of this world.
This week on China Uncensored, Trump spends the week calling out China. Floods wreak havoc across most Chinese provinces. And people are calling to ban TikTok. Monday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern on NTD America.
The coronavirus outbreak is the latest wake-up call.
U.S. Senator Ben Sasse put it plainly. The Chinese Communist Party has lied, is lying, and will continue to lie about coronavirus to protect the regime.
In 5 to 10 years, we'll have virtually no manufacturing capacity left for generic drugs. And again, this is 90% of our medicines.
And the world should know, if Hong Kong falls, the whole world falls, okay? Because the Chinese Communist Party is the existential risk of humanity, period.
Since the CCP took power, 80 million people have died from its policies and political campaigns.
They're using our institutions and our norms and our values against us in ways that we hadn't necessarily envisioned towards their own authoritarian agenda.
From the party's great firewall in cyberspace, or to that great wall of sand in the South China Sea.
More repression, more unfair competition, more predatory economic practices, indeed a more aggressive military posture as well.
If we do not meet this threat now, it's going to define our century.
Tonight, Major League Baseball becomes the first of the big 3 American pro sports leagues to start play since the CCP virus outbreak halted the 2020 season. It's a matchup between the defending World Series Nationals and the New York Yankees.
Nearly 4 months behind schedule, Major League Baseball is set to begin the 2020 regular season. Leading off, a marquee matchup here in Washington, the New York Yankees and defending World Series champion Nationals.
This will be our first game since winning the World Series, and sort of the celebration and virtual fanfare around that, and I think it's going to make for a really special night.
Without the hot dogs, the peanuts, the Cracker Jacks, and 7th-inning stretches, the season to be played without fans in the stands, just simulated crowd noise. For players, no high fives. For managers, no lineup card exchanges or arguing with umps. For all on and around the field, multiple COVID-19 tests per week. The adoption of the designated hitter in the National League and extra innings beginning with a runner on second among the changes to move game pace along. Still, the 60-game season was a risk some players weren't willing to take, despite MLB's extensive health and safety protocols. It's also a risk Canada wasn't willing to take. The country denied the Blue Jays' request to play home games in Toronto because of cross-border travel. Even with limited regional schedules, some clubs will still have to travel to current coronavirus hotspots to play teams in Arizona, California, Texas, and Florida.
In France, an annual Paris beach event opened this week, welcoming tourists and residents. But the virus made things a little different this year. NTD's France correspondent David Vives has the details.
Watching a movie from a boat on the Seine, these Paris residents are enjoying a floating open-air cinema. Each year, Paris transforms part of the banks of the Seine into a relaxing place where residents and tourists enjoy the city's summer festivities.
I'm super excited. It's a really unique opportunity. I've never seen anything like this in Paris, so super excited.
But despite the usual leisure activities, this year's different. The City Hall tightened health restrictions due to the pandemic at a time when Paris usually counts more tourists than residents. For street food shop owner Jean-Paul Defort, he's had only 30% of his usual number of visitors.
This is an exceptional year, not in terms of our revenue, but considering our challenges. Can consider ourselves lucky compared to some countries that are going through another round of lockdown.
While the virus has been under control in France, with fatalities and the number of people in intensive care falling, authorities are concerned about what could happen next. There's been a spike in cases in neighboring countries like Spain, which imposed a second lockdown on 4 million residents in Barcelona. Medical teams are in place at 2 locations until the end of August, with a capacity to carry out between 150 to 200 tests a day. Reporting by David Vives, NTD News.
And that's all for today's news. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Stephanie Cox.
Tens of thousands of Falun Gong practitioners from all over the country was sent to that sports stadium by bus and forced by the armed police to line up.
Completely transform who they are into obedient followers of the communist state, or they're going to die in the process.
U.S. officials cite subversive behavior and stealing trade secrets as reasons for closing the Chinese consulate in Houston. They describe the consulate as an epicenter of research theft. A person with connections to China's military is reportedly hiding out at the Chinese consulate in San Francisco. President Trump says it's always possible that more Chinese missions will be shut down. Under pressure from Beijing's draconian security law, many businesses in Hong Kong were quick to self-censor, but some have found creative ways to express their demands. 3 senior infectious disease specialists resigned from the University of Hong Kong. They're from the same university as the whistleblower that recently disclosed the CCP's virus cover-up. And a 3rd provincial region in China reports new virus cases. This follows outbreaks in Beijing and Xinjiang. Now hundreds of thousands will be tested for the virus there. Tune in at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time and tomorrow at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time to watch the full China in Focus.